Hello again, everyone. Really glad that you can sit down and watch this video. For those of you who are just now tuning in, we've been going through a series. This is part 3 of 5 facts of the resurrection. So we've been kind of slowly plotting our way through those 5 facts, and we've covered 2 of those 5 facts. So if you haven't watched those videos, really encourage you to go back and watch them. As I mentioned this morning, this has been really helpful just for my faith to see that when you establish these 5 facts, and we're going to see this, we'll develop this further, but when you establish these 5 facts, you see that not only is it okay to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but you see that that actually is a logical explanation for what we know. And we're going to learn about that more and more. But for those of you who have been following along, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here. Of course, we've been going over the 5 facts of the resurrection, and I just want to kind of review what those 5 facts are really quick. Of course, fact number 1 is that Jesus was crucified, and we were able to establish that really easily, where we see not only, of course, do we have the New Testament account showing us that Jesus was crucified. We see it in all 4 Gospels, and also it's throughout the New Testament that people witnessed this, that they believed it happened, and we have the actual record that it happened. But we also have outside secular sources as well that testify to this being a historical fact. And so we developed that in our first video. And the last time we met, we talked about the second fact, which is that the disciples believed he rose from the dead. And we weren't trying to prove to people right out the gate that he actually did rise from the dead, but all we want to do is establish that the disciples genuinely believed he rose from the dead. And the reason they believed this is because they said that they saw him. So this wasn't based on somebody else's testimony. In fact, we saw in Acts chapter 2 that Peter, in that sermon, when he's talking about the resurrection, told the people that were present, he said, "Of this, we are all witnesses." And so from the get-go, they were claiming not to just have heard that this happened, not to have just had faith that it happened, but they were claiming to be actual eyewitnesses of these events. And so we're going to kind of probably develop that second fact even further when we look at our third and fourth facts, which is that Paul was converted, and that's going to be a very important fact to establish. And then we're also going to see that James was converted. And what we're going to see is that these 2 men were skeptics, and they went from being skeptics to church leaders. So you'll notice there at the top that this slide says the 5 facts of the resurrection. I have in parentheses 4 plus 1. The reason why I have that is because these 4, we call this a minimum facts approach. That is, again, we're not trying to just prove instantly that Jesus rose from the dead out of the gate. We want to establish just some bare minimal facts and then see what the best explanation of those facts are. And so when you look at these first 4, these are universally acknowledged. In other words, it's not just Bible believers that acknowledge these things as being facts, but it's New Testament scholars that are themselves atheists or skeptics or agnostics. These aren't people that have a bias towards Christianity. They unanimously are in approval that these are 4 facts that you just cannot deny. And so that brings us eventually to the plus 1, which we're not going to cover. The reason why I call it a 4 plus 1 is because the empty tomb is going to be our 5th fact. And I believe that to be a fact. However, there are some people that are resistant to that. These first 4 are unanimous, as close to 100% as you can get. Of course, there's always people that are just unreasonable. But they're what we would say unanimously agreed upon. The empty tomb, however, it's still high. It's about 75% of scholars. And I would submit to you the reason why that 25% don't acknowledge the empty tomb is because they realize the implications if the tomb was indeed empty. And the reason I say that is because when you establish all 5 of these facts, we'll see in a future video that the alternative explanations are really poor, especially when you have all these 5 facts working together. Whatever explanation we have, it has to explain all five of these facts, especially the first four, right? But that'll be a future video. For now, I just want to talk to you guys about the third and fourth facts, which is, of course, first off, that Paul was converted. Now, Paul, I mean, we all love Paul. Paul gives us so much encouragement. He makes us hopeful that we can see someone go from being so wicked, so against Christ, and now all of a sudden converted. And of course, we see that Paul was persecuting the church, firstly in Acts chapter 8. Here it says in verse 1, and this is Luke's account, right? Luke wrote the book of Acts. He says, and Saul approved of his execution. So here we're reading about, we're just following Acts chapter 7, of course, where Stephen is martyred, right? Stephen is killed. He's testifying against the Jews, saying they're a stiff-necked generation, that they need to repent, that Jesus is Lord. And of course, what happens after that? He gets stoned by the Jews for professing Jesus as Lord. And it says that Saul approved of his execution. Now, Saul, of course, is another name for Paul. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him, but Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. And so when you look at this, Paul, he wasn't some middle of the road, I could go one way or the other. He was absolutely against the move of Christianity. And that's really important to see and establish, because so far, maybe people will look at the disciples and they'll say, well, they wanted to believe in a resurrected Jesus because they believed he was the Messiah all along. And what were they going to do after he died? Maybe they just made this up as a way to feeling justified for claiming him to be the Messiah. But that explanation doesn't work for Paul. He not only was a skeptic, okay? It's not that he was agnostic about who Jesus was. Agnostic means I don't know, right? It's not that he was saying I don't know. He believed Jesus was a blasphemer, that he was a false prophet, a false Messiah. He was a liar, and he believed that anybody who followed him was equal or equally responsible of that guilt. And so what was his response? He was ravaging the church. That's a violent word. It means to cause harm or to injure. He was not light in the way that he went about persecuting the church. He was leading the charge. And we learn elsewhere that as they were stoning Stephen, that not only was he approving, but he's holding the garments or watching over the garments of those who were stoning him. And so this is not just written about in Luke. This isn't like we have one passage that talks about how Paul persecuted the church, how he was a skeptic, right? It's multiply attested. It starts with Paul attesting it himself. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 15:9, he says, I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God, in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 9. And then in Galatians 1 and verse 13, he talks about how he's acknowledging what they've heard about him. He says, you've heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. So he's acknowledging, hey, you've heard of who I was. This was common knowledge. This is what was going around about Paul as they learned that he was this vehement preacher of the faith, but they were also learning that his zeal was similar to when he was a Jew, except it wasn't for Jesus, it was against Jesus. And even in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 6, when he's talking about his accolades as a Jew, he says, as to zeal, I was a persecutor of the church, right? And so we already have 3 times. And then in Luke wrote Acts, right? He writes down this speech. We have a record of a speech that Paul was giving. And he talks about himself in Acts 22 and verse 20. He says, when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. So you have to ask yourself, why would Paul make this up? I mean, who in the right mind would make up, hey, you know what? I used to violently harm Christians. I used to put them in jail. I was a blasphemer of the way of the truth. why would he make that up? It's just, that's not something that you do. And so it's self-attested. But then we can kind of extrapolate from those verses that not only was it attested by Paul, but Luke records these events. In fact, he recorded the event just as an objective historian that we read in Acts chapter 8. And he's writing about how Paul was persecuting the church. So not only does Paul attest to it to himself, but Luke also attests to the fact that Paul was a persecutor of the church. And then also in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 23, and we actually kind of see it in verse 13 as well if we go back and look at this slide, but he says, "You've heard of my former life in Judaism." So not only is it attested by Paul and Luke, but we also see that it was just news that was circulating around the church, and that in Galatians 1 verse 23, Paul's talking about how in Judea, the people hadn't seen his face yet. They just had heard that he was persecuting the church, right? And so these are things that were going around, and it turns out in verse 23 that they glorified God because, he goes from being this persecutor to being a preacher of the faith. So Paul, multiply attested he was more than a skeptic. He was a persecutor. And so, when you read about Saul, all of a sudden we go from Saul to Paul. It's no longer Saul, the persecutor of the church, no longer Saul of Tarsus, but it goes to Paul the apostle. And with that comes all sorts of changes other than his name, right? It was a transformation. He's no longer persecuting the way, but he's championing the way. And why is it that he had such a dramatic change? Well, it's because he claims that he had an encounter with Jesus. I mean, how do you account for somebody going from persecuting the church to now joining that group of people in their in being persecuted, right? I mean, he had nothing to gain by making that switch aside from the fact that he's getting eternal life through his Lord Jesus Christ. And he claims that the reason why he made that change is because he had an encounter, a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. We read about it in Acts chapter 9. Again, this is actually Luke's account. So it's being attested by Luke that this happened as well. But then Paul, he talks about it in chapter 22, and he talks about it in chapter 26, how Jesus literally appeared to him. He heard the voice of Jesus, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Right? Then finally in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 8, he's going through that list of the people that Jesus appeared to, and he says, finally, he appeared to me. And he says, "I'm the least of all the apostles because I persecuted the church." And furthermore, we see it was more than a claim, like we've already established. He was willing to suffer for the claim, right? So he's putting, his money where his mouth is, so to speak. And so, again, we have record of that in Acts. He's in and out of prison constantly, right? And we have the prison epistles that Paul's life didn't get easier when he started preaching about Christ, when he converted to Christianity. It got harder. And it wasn't like he was immediately accepted. Remember when he initially tried to go to Jerusalem and join the church there, nobody trusted him. They didn't want to worship with him. You can understand why, because he was putting some of their family in jail and persecuting the church. And it took Barnabas to kind of vouch for him. But we see historically he was indeed willing to suffer. Clement of Rome talks about it. Polycarp, these are all early 2nd century. Polycarp talks about it, who we said was a follower or a student of the Apostle John, and also Tertullian writes about it. And keep in mind, when you have these historical records, this is just what's available to us today. Chances are that these men had other historical records that were available to them as well that, unfortunately, we no longer have access to. But he was willing to suffer for the claim. And historically, we understand that he was martyred for this. And now finally, just one quick point that we want to make. And I know that we kind of made it last week or 2 weeks ago when we were talking about how the disciples believed he was raised and how they were willing to die for it. Paul's testimony wasn't based on secondary evidence. What do I mean by that? Well, when you or I convert to Christianity, it's based off of secondary evidence, isn't it? In other words, we're reading this book, we're reading the Bible, and we read about how Peter was a witness. We see that Paul was willing to suffer. We read about Jesus being crucified and then being raised and the empty tomb. We read about all these things, but it's secondary evidence, which isn't bad. You can build a good case on secondary evidence. But what I want us to understand is that Paul's testimony was based on primary evidence. His conversion was based on primary evidence. In other words, it wasn't based off of what he heard about Jesus, it was based off of what he himself experienced. That he saw Jesus. He had an encounter with him on the way to Damascus. He heard his voice and followed his command to go and see Ananias, where he was eventually baptized and had his sins washed away. It's based on primary evidence, not secondary evidence. Saul to Paul goes from church persecutor to being a preacher and being an apostle of Christ. Then we get to James. James, the brother of Jesus. And, you know, it's interesting. You read about the brothers and the family didn't believe what he was saying. They thought that he was a madman, and we see that in these following verses. And in John chapter 7, verse 5, it just blatantly tells us that his brothers didn't even believe what he was saying. And James is enumerated in Mark's account as being a brother of Jesus. Well, that's really interesting. And, you know, can you really blame him? I was watching a documentary on Michael Jordan this last week, and they're interviewing one of Michael Jordan's brothers. And I was just thinking, how difficult would that be to be Michael Jordan's brother, right? But now multiply that by 100 million when you're talking about being the Lord's brother. What kind of humility would it take to say, hey, you're my brother, you're also my Lord? Those of us who have brothers, we can relate to that, can't we? And so they were skeptic for one reason or another. Maybe it had nothing to do with him being their brother, but they were skeptic. They didn't believe him themselves. And James is included in that. And what's really interesting about that is that in 2002, there was this ossuary of bones that was found in an archaeological dig. It's dated back to the 1st century, and on it is engraved the words James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, there's been a lot of debate over whether or not it's genuinely referring to, you know, the James we read about in the Bible, or maybe perhaps that it's fraudulent or whatever. But it's dated back to the 1st century. It is a legit ossuary. But regardless of if it was actually holding the bones of James, the brother of Jesus, it still shows us how important of a figure James must have been back then. If somebody was willing to, you know, forge an ossuary of bones on his behalf, he goes from being skeptic to being this kind of icon of the faith in the 1st century, and we have archaeological evidence attesting to that. I think that's amazing. And furthermore, we have Josephus, and he refers to James, and he just simply says, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James. And so, of course, he's historically a well-known figure. But what I want us to understand is that we see in the Gospels that he's this skeptic, that he doesn't believe. He thinks his brother, Jesus, is crazy. But then we see him, you know, in one of the epistles of Paul and Galatians, in fact, but especially in Acts chapter 15. And also James writes his own letter, right? The book of James. We see in Acts chapter 15 that there was this problem in the church. And there's people that were basically wanting to integrate the Jewish law with the Christian faith. And so finally, you know, the leaders of the church, they said, we need to have a conversation about this. We need to settle this once and for all. And so that's what we read about in Acts chapter 15. And, you know, after listening to Paul and Barnabas, this council in Jerusalem, finally, James, he speaks up. And he says, therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols and from sexual immorality and from what has been strangled and from blood. And that's kind of the last word on this meeting that they have, according to Luke's account in Acts. And so we see that he goes from skeptic to being this revered person of faith in the first century, in the book of Acts, and in the New Testament. And so again, we ask the question like we did with Paul, well, how? How do you go from being a skeptic of your brother being the Christ to all of a sudden feeling like you have ample evidence to believe your brother was the Christ? What would it take for you? Those people that are out there that have siblings, what kind of evidence would it take for you to accept that? And keep in mind, not only is James having to accept that Jesus is the Christ, he's also having to admit that he was wrong, which is hard to do with siblings, right? Because he formerly rejected him as being the Christ. And now all of a sudden, it's the same thing with Paul. He goes from skeptic to being a leader in the church. How do you explain that? Well, Paul gives us an explanation in 1 Corinthians 15 in verse 6. He's talking about the people again that Jesus appeared to. We've looked at this passage multiple times. It says he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. He appeared to James. He appeared to his brother. And there's one individual who has made the point. And by the way, this is, again, as you read 1 Corinthians 15 and you're reading this opening section in there, it's oral tradition. You can see Paul says, hey, I delivered to you that which I also received. And he's reminding them of that. And one of those things was that he appeared to James, his brother. It was going around. But you see that he went from skeptic to leader. And there's somebody that once said that yes, 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 7 has the force of just being common knowledge, of being an oral tradition during that time. But one critical scholar named Reginald Fuller says that even without 1 Corinthians 5 verses 6 and 7, he said we should have to invent such an appearance in order to account for two things: James' conversion from skepticism and his elevation to the pastorate of the church in Jerusalem, the center of ancient Christianity. How do you go from skeptic to being a leader of the church? You need to explain how you get from point A to point B. Well, to me, the simplest explanation is exactly what Paul is telling us here, that he saw evidence that was compelling enough for him to change his mind and say, this isn't my brother, this is my Lord. And so you see James and Paul go from skepticism to leaders. It's really an amazing thing. And you see that even James was willing to die for it. Josephus talks about how he was stoned, and his martyrdom is multiply attested. So it's kind of the same idea. Paul was willing to die. It wasn't just something that he was saying. He didn't have something to gain from it. He met an early death because of what he believed and what he testified. And he died as a lawbreaker, which, people who broke the Jewish law were known as lawbreakers, and they think that's what's being referred to here, that somehow his Christian faith caused him to break the old law according to the Jews of that time. And they had him stoned because of it. And Josephus, who is non-Christian, he attests to that fact. So we got 4 evidences. Jesus was crucified. The disciples believed that he rose from the dead. Paul goes from persecutor to apostle. James goes from skeptic to admitting that his Lord is somebody that once was his brother on earth. And so these are 4 facts. We're going to finally look at the 5th fact 2 weeks from now. And to me, it's the most important and it's the most compelling point. And that 5th fact is the empty tomb. We're going to talk about that, but thank you for your time. And I hope that this was helpful to you as it has been to me.